The spring of 1940 bore witness across Europe to something unprecedented in the history of aerial warfare. German fighters were destroying Allied aircraft with an efficiency that bordered on the surgical. In London, Paris, and Washington, military planners reviewed intelligence reports with growing alarm. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf Flo 190 were not merely good aircraft, they represented a fundamental shift in aerial combat capability. They were faster, better armed, and more maneuverable than anything the Allies could field. On a train rattling through the American countryside, somewhere between Dayton, Ohio, and New York City, a 43-year-old Georgian immigrant named Alexander Kartveli sat alone in a passenger car, staring at a blank sheet of paper. Hours earlier, at Wright Field, United States Army Air Corps officials had informed him that his company's fighter designs, the XP-47A and the XP-44 rocket, were being cancelled. 2 years of work, millions of dollars, gone. The airframes were simply too small to meet the new requirements that battlefield realities in Europe had dictated. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The requirements themselves seem to contradict the laws of physics. The Army wanted a fighter capable of reaching 40,000 feet higher than any single-engine fighter had ever operated. It needed to achieve a true airspeed of at least 400 miles per hour at that altitude. It had to carry not 6, but 8 heavy machine guns, all mounted in the wings, not the nose. It needed armor to protect the pilot. It needed self-sealing fuel tanks, and somehow, despite all this weight, it still had to fly like a fighter. Kartveli pulled out his pencil and began to sketch. What emerged on that piece of paper, drawn not in an engineering office, but on a moving train by a man who had every reason to feel defeated, would become the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. It would be the largest, heaviest single-engine fighter aircraft ever built during World War II. Pilots who first saw it parked beside their nimble Spitfires would be horrified, certain they were looking at their own death sentence. Critics would call it a dinosaur, a flying milk jug, an impossibility. But by war's end, this supposedly impossible fighter would carry more bombs and rockets than many medium bombers. It would destroy more German tanks, locomotives, and trucks than any other Allied fighter, and it would bring more American pilots home alive than perhaps any other aircraft in the sky. This is the story of how one refugee designer's wings shouldn't have worked according to conventional wisdom and how they changed the nature of aerial warfare forever. It is a story not of a single invention, but of the collision between Enflanktes port, immigrants' determination, and the brutal mathematics of modern war. Alexander Kartveli was born on September 9, 1896, in Tbilisi, Georgia, then part of the vast Russian Empire. The city sat at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, a place where ancient trade routes met the modern aspirations of the early 20th century. Young Alexander grew up in a Georgia that was experiencing its own renaissance, a brief flowering of national identity and cultural pride before the storms of revolution and war would sweep it all away. He graduated from grammar school in Tbilisi in 1914, just as the world descended into the chaos of the First World War. Kartveli served as an artillerist during that conflict, witnessing firsthand the transformation of warfare from cavalry charges to industrialized slaughter. He was wounded, though the details of that injury would remain classified for decades, buried in the security protocols that would later surround his work in America. But artillery was not his passion. Even as shells arced across muddy battlefields, Kartveli dreamed of aircraft. The nascent field of aviation captured his imagination in a way that few things could. These were machines that defied gravity itself, that promised to make the world simultaneously larger and smaller. In the chaos of war and revolution, aviation represented possibility. When the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia, Georgia briefly declared independence in 1918. For a flickering moment, there was hope. The young Democratic Republic of Georgia possessed an aviation fleet of up to 50 aircraft, but it lacked pilots and aviation specialists. The government recognized Kartveli's potential, and, in 1919, sent him to Paris to study at the Higher School of Aeronautics and Mechanical Construction, known formally as the Institut Supérieur de l'Aéronautique et de l'Espace. He left Georgia with his mother, leaving other family members behind. It was not meant to be permanent exile, merely an education followed by a return home to help build Georgia's Air Force. But history had other plans. In 1921, the Red Army invaded Georgia. The brief independence ended. The country fell under Soviet control. Kartveli would never return to his homeland. Paris, in the 1920s, was the epicenter of aviation innovation. The war had accelerated aircraft development beyond all recognition, and now, in peacetime, designers and pilots pushed boundaries with an almost reckless enthusiasm. Kartveli graduated in 1922 and immediately found work with Blériot Aéronautique, the company founded by Louis Blériot, who had made the first heavier-than-air flight across the English Channel in 1909. Between 1922 and 1927, Kartveli worked on designs for both Blériot and other French manufacturers, participating in the development of Bernard and Furbois aircraft. During this period, one of his design's accounts vary on the specific aircraft established a world speed record. For a young engineer barely into his 20s, displaced from his homeland and working in a foreign country, this was validation. He possessed not merely competence, but genius. Yet Paris, for all its attractions, was still someone else's city. America beckoned. In 1927, American millionaire Charles Levine flushed from his own Atlantic crossing as a passenger aboard the Columbia, just weeks after Charles Lindbergh's solo flight was looking to establish himself in aviation manufacturing. He invited Kartveli to New York to join the Atlantic Aircraft Corporation, later known as Atlantic Fokker. Kartveli arrived as he had arrived in Paris, penniless, carrying little more than his education and his ambition. The Atlantic aircraft venture eventually failed, as so many aviation companies did in those tumultuous years. But Kartveli's reputation had preceded him. In 1931, he met another Georgian exile, Alexander P-47, born in Georgia, though of Russian descent. P-47 had been a naval aviator in the Russian Empire, had lost his right leg in combat, and had continued flying regardless. After the revolution, he had made his way to America and, by 1931, had founded the Seversky Aircraft Corporation in Farmingdale, Long Island. Seversky recognized in Kartveli a kindred spirit, another man displaced by revolution, another believer in aviation's transformative power. He hired Kartveli almost immediately as chief engineer. The two men, both from Tbilisi, both refugees from Bolshevism, would work together to create some of America's most important military aircraft. Kartveli quickly proved his worth. He designed the SEV-1XP, which outperformed the Curtiss P-36 Hawk during a 1936 Army Air Corps competition. This led to the Seversky P-35, designated by the military as America's first modern fighter, incorporating an all-metal fuselage, low-set wings, retractable landing gear, and a radial engine. It was a necessary step in the evolution of American fighter design, even if it would be quickly superseded. But the shadow of security concerns followed Kartveli throughout these years. The American government, aware of his origins and his recent immigration, maintained surveillance on him and other foreign-born engineers. The fears were not entirely without foundation. Industrial espionage was real, and the Soviets actively sought technological secrets. But for Kartveli, a man who had fled Soviet tyranny, the irony was bitter. He had escaped one surveillance state only to find himself watched by another, albeit for different reasons. The details of his work remained classified. His name rarely appeared in public. When Time magazine profiled him briefly in March of 1942, they wrote, "In the great group effort of aviation design, many a man who has put new craft in the air has escaped public attention. One such is 45-year-old designer Kartveli. He would remain in the shadows for decades, designing weapons to defeat the very totalitarianism he had fled. By 1939, Seversky had lost control of his own company. Financial troubles and management disputes led to a reorganization. The company was reborn as Republic Aviation Corporation, with Kartveli remaining as chief engineer and vice president. De Savesky was out. Kartveli stayed. He had work to do. The work was urgent. In September of 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The Second World War had begun, and within months, it became clear that this would be unlike any previous conflict. The speed and violence of the German blitzkrieg shocked military observers. France, considered to possess the world's finest army, would fall in a matter of weeks in the spring of 1940. At the heart of German success was air superiority, achieved by fighters that were simply better than what the Allies possessed. Republic Aviation had been developing fighters in a lineage that traced back to the P-35. The P-43 Lancer was in limited production. Republic had proposed an improved P-44 rocket with a more powerful engine, as well as a lightweight fighter designated the AP-10, which the Army had given the designation XP-47. The AP-10 was to be powered by an Allison V-1710 liquid-cooled V-12 engine and armed with only 2 half-inch machine guns in the nose and 4 smaller guns in the wings. But intelligence reports from Europe made it clear these designs were already obsolete before they flew. The German Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 could outperform them in virtually every category. American pilots would be sent to their deaths in inferior machines. In the spring of 1940, Republic and the Army Air Corps reached the same conclusion. Simultaneously, the XP-44 and the XP-47 designs had to be scrapped. The requirements had changed fundamentally. It was not enough to build a good fighter. America needed a great one. In June of 1940, a meeting took place at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. Present were military officials including General Carl Spaatz and Colonel Benjamin Kelsey, along with Republic executives including C. Hart Miller, Vice President of Sales, and Alexander Kartveli, Vice President of Engineering. The attendees began describing the specifications that would be needed for a fighter aircraft for the war that everyone tacitly agreed was coming to America sooner or later. Kartveli listened as the requirements were laid out. The fighter would require a ceiling of 40,000 feet operational altitude, where the thin air challenged both engines and pilots. It needed a maximum true airspeed of at least 400 miles per hour at that optimum altitude, no fewer than 6 machine guns, with room for 8, and all of them mounted in the wings, not the nose. The European practice of using heavy-caliber nose-mounted cannons often required reducing the propelling powder charge to manage recoil, so those shells, while destructive on impact, lacked the reach of lighter, faster machine gun rounds. American doctrine favored the half-inch Browning machine gun for its range, rate of fire, and hitting power. Kartveli understood immediately what this meant. He had been at this work long enough to grasp the brutal arithmetic of aircraft design. Every pound of weight in the wings, guns, ammunition, the structure to mount them, the mechanisms to fire them had to be lifted by those same wings. Heavy armament meant a larger, stronger wing. Armor to protect the pilot added more weight. Self-sealing fuel tanks, essential after watching so many Allied fighters burn over Europe, added still more weight. A turbocharger system to reach 40,000 feet would be massive, requiring elaborate ducting throughout the fuselage. And then there was the engine itself. To power such an aircraft at such speeds and altitudes, you needed the largest, most powerful engine available. That meant the new Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp, an 18-cylinder, 2-row radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower. It was the most powerful aircraft engine yet developed in the United States, and it was enormous. Based on an estimated combat weight of 12,000 pounds, nearly 3 times heavier than many contemporary fighters, Kartveli sketched a semi-elliptical wing with an area of 300 square feet. That sketch, made during the meeting or shortly thereafter, captured the essence of what would become the Thunderbolt. Then came the devastating news. On September 6, 1940, the Army notified Kartveli officially that the XP-47A and the XP-44 rocket contracts were cancelled. The P-43/XP-44 airframe was too small to meet the new requirements, The XP-44 rocket had been based on the P-43 Lancer airframe with an even more powerful radial engine, but it never made it past the mock-up stage. 2 years of engineering work erased. Kartveli boarded a train back to New York. The journey from Dayton to New York covered approximately 600 miles and took the better part of a day in 1940. It provided time to think, time to sketch, time to reimagine everything. According to the historical record, during that return journey, Kartveli took a sheet of paper and drew a completely new design. The new aircraft, he determined, would be built to break the back of the German Luftwaffe. He would not try to match German fighters with incremental improvements. He would create something entirely different. The design philosophy was radical. Kartveli decided that the turbocharger air duct system, the elaborate network of pipes that would route exhaust gases from the engine in the nose back to the turbocharger in the tail, then route the compressed air back forward to the engine, would be designed first. Then the rest of the aircraft would be built around that ducting. This was backwards from normal aircraft design, where the airframe came first and systems were fitted into available space. But Kartveli understood that the turbocharger system was non-negotiable. It had to work perfectly, with smooth airflow and minimal turbulence, or the entire aircraft would fail to meet its high-altitude performance requirements. The wing he sketched featured a semi-elliptical planform, a graceful shape that provided excellent aerodynamic efficiency while offering sufficient internal volume for fuel, guns, ammunition, and landing gear. The airfoil section would be a custom design, later designated as Republic's 3, optimized for the specific requirements of this massive fighter. When Kartveli arrived back in Farmingdale and presented his concept to his engineering team, there must have been skepticism. What he was proposing was not an evolution of previous designs, but a revolution. It would be the largest single-engine fighter anyone had attempted to build. It would be powered by an engine so large it required a 4-bladed propeller, 12 feet in diameter, a propeller so massive that conventional landing gear would be impossible. But Republic Aviation submitted the design proposal to the U.S. Army Air Corps on June 12, 1940, barely weeks after that train journey. On September 6th, the same day the old contracts were cancelled, the new prototype was ordered. A week later, on September 13th, the Army ordered 161 production P-47Bs and 602 P-47Cs, even before the prototype had flown. The contract was for $56,499,924, an astronomical sum for aircraft that existed only on paper. This leap of faith was possible only because the war situation was so desperate. France had fallen in June. The Battle of Britain was raging that very September as the Luftwaffe attempted to destroy the Royal Air Force as a prelude to invasion. America was still neutral, but military planners understood that neutrality was temporary. They needed fighters, and they needed them soon, even if those fighters were as yet unbuilt and unproven. The company named the new fighter Thunderbolt, a name suggested by C. Hart Miller, director of the Military Contracts Division of Republic Aviation. It evoked power, violence, the overwhelming force of nature. It was an appropriate name for what Kartveli had designed. The challenge now was to make it real. The Republic's 3 airfoil was a critical innovation, though one rarely discussed in popular accounts of the P-47. An airfoil is the cross-sectional shape of a wing, and it determines how air flows over and under that wing, creating lift. Different missions require different airfoils. A high-altitude interceptor needs an airfoil that performs well in thin air. A ground attack aircraft needs one that generates lift at low altitudes and slow speeds. The P-47 would eventually have to do both. Kartveli's team developed an airfoil that balanced these competing demands. The resulting wing had a straight leading edge that was slightly swept back, transitioning into the semi-elliptical shape at the tips. This provided good high-speed characteristics while maintaining adequate low-speed handling. The wing area of 300 square feet was enormous for a single-engine fighter. Compare this to the Supermarine Spitfire's 242 square feet or the Messerschmitt Bf 109's 100 74 square feet. But that large wing was necessary to lift the weight Kartveli knew his design would carry. The empty weight of the XP-47B would be 9,900 pounds, 65% heavier than the earlier P-43. At maximum combat weight, fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and external stores, a P-47 could exceed 16,000 pounds, reaching 8 tons in some configurations. The engine installation presented its own challenges. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp was a masterpiece of engineering, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, producing 2,000 horsepower from a displacement of 2,804 cubic inches. But harnessing that power required solving multiple problems simultaneously. First was the propeller. A conventional 3-bladed propeller could not efficiently utilize 2,000 horsepower. The solution was a 4-bladed Curtiss electric constant-speed propeller, 146 inches 12 feet, 2 inches in diameter. This massive propeller could absorb the engine's power and convert it into thrust, but it created its own problem: ground clearance. If Republic used a conventional landing gear tall enough to provide clearance for that 12-foot propeller, the landing gear attachment points would have to be so far outboard on the wing that there would be no room for the guns and ammunition the Army required. The landing gear struts would consume the very wing space Kartveli needed for armament. The solution was mechanically ingenious and, in 1940, unprecedented. Kartveli designed a telescoping landing gear system. Each main landing gear strut was fitted with a mechanism that allowed it to extend 9 inches as it deployed. When retracted, the landing gear was 9 inches shorter than when extended. This seemingly small innovation solved a critical problem. The gear could attach close to the fuselage, leaving wing space for armament, while still providing sufficient propeller clearance when extended for landing. The armament installation itself was a marvel of packaging. 8 Browning AN/M2 machine guns, each firing half-inch caliber rounds, were mounted 4 per wing. The guns were staggered in position to allow feeding from side-by-side ammunition boxes, each containing 350 rounds. This totaled 2,800 rounds of ammunition, approximately 17 seconds of sustained fire. All 8 guns firing simultaneously produced a combined rate of fire around 100 rounds per second, nearly 11 pounds of projectiles per second at muzzle velocity. The recoil forces from firing all 8 guns simultaneously were substantial. The wing structure had to absorb these loads repeatedly without failing, while also handling the aerodynamic stresses of high-speed flight, the weight of fuel and external stores, and the impact loads of combat damage. Kartveli's team designed a wing that could do all this, though it required careful engineering and extensive structural reinforcement. Fuel capacity was another critical consideration. The Army specifications called for range sufficient to escort bombers deep into enemy territory. Internal fuel tanks were located under the cockpit, a main tank holding 270 US gallons aft of the fireproof bulkhead and an auxiliary tank holding 100 gallons beneath the pilot's seat. These tanks were self-sealing, meaning they incorporated layers of rubber that would swell when exposed to fuel, automatically closing small punctures from enemy fire. This technology, developed in response to watching too many early war fighters burn after single bullet strikes, added weight but saved countless lives. 370 gallons of internal fuel was substantial, but Kartveli knew it would not be enough. From the beginning, he incorporated provisions for external fuel tanks, drop tanks that could be jettisoned when empty or when entering combat. The P-47C2 introduced a centerline hardpoint capable of carrying either a 500-pound bomb or a P-200-gallon fuel tank. Later versions would add wing-mounted hardpoints, allowing the fighter to carry drop tanks under both wings, as well as the fuselage centerline. The turbocharger system was perhaps the most unconventional aspect of the design. Turbocharging using exhaust gases to spin a turbine that drives a compressor, forcing more air into the engine, was the key to high-altitude performance. At 40,000 feet, the air is so thin that a normally aspirated engine produces only a fraction of its sea-level power. A properly designed turbocharger system could maintain near sea-level power output even at extreme altitudes. But implementing this system in a fighter aircraft was extraordinarily difficult. The turbocharger itself was massive and had to be located in the rear fuselage, near the tail. Exhaust gases from the engine in the nose had to be ducted backward through two large pipes running along each side of the cockpit. These pipes glowed cherry red during operation. The turbines spun at tremendous speeds, and the compressed air then had to be routed forward again through intercoolers to reduce its temperature before entering the engine. The entire lower fuselage of the P-47 was essentially devoted to this ducting system. Kartveli designed the ducts first, ensuring smooth airflow with minimal turbulence, then built the fuselage around them. This backward approach to design was vindicated by the results. The turbocharger system worked remarkably well and proved durable and resistant to battle damage. The cockpit was unusually spacious for a fighter. One pilot later described the seat as being like a lounge chair. This was partly because the large fuselage, necessitated by the turbocharger ducting, provided more internal volume than a typical fighter. But it was also intentional design. A comfortable pilot is a more effective pilot, especially on long missions at extreme altitudes. The cockpit was air-conditioned, a rarity in 1941 to keep the pilot functional in the thin, cold air at 40,000 feet. Visibility was initially adequate but not exceptional, limited by the original framed canopy that hinged upward. Later production versions would incorporate a bubble canopy that greatly improved the pilot's ability to see behind and to the sides, critical in aerial combat, where most kills came from attacks the victim never saw coming. The XP-47B prototype bore serial number 40-3051. It represented 8 months of frantic engineering work, from contract award in September of 1940 to first flight in May of 1941. This was an almost impossibly compressed timeline for designing, engineering, and building an entirely new aircraft, especially one as large and complex as the Thunderbolt. Test pilot Lowry Lawson Brabham was selected to make the first flight. On May 6, 1941, Brabham climbed into the cockpit at Republic's factory airfield in Farmingdale, Long Island. The prototype was not scheduled to fly that day. This was meant to be a high-speed taxi test, but Brabham apparently decided that the aircraft felt ready. He advanced the throttle, the massive R-2800 engine roared to life, and the XP-47B lifted into the air. Immediately, problems became apparent. Oil in the exhaust duct system began to smoke, filling the cockpit with acrid fumes. The prototype had no radio, so Brabham could not communicate with ground crew. For several minutes, as the smoke thickened, he seriously considered bailing out, abandoning the prototype on its first flight. But the aircraft was flying well despite the smoke, and Mitchell Field, a proper military airfield with a longer paved runway, was only a short distance away. Brabham elected to continue. He flew the smoking prototype to Mitchell Field and landed successfully. Upon climbing out of the cockpit, oil-stained and coughing, he reportedly told the assembled engineers and military officials, "We've hit the jackpot." It was a characteristically optimistic assessment, and one that would prove prescient. But between that first flight in May of 1941 and the P-47's combat debut nearly 2 years later, significant problems had to be solved. Production aircraft, designated P-47B, began rolling off Republic's assembly lines in March of 1942. The first production aircraft was delivered on March 18th, but early testing revealed troubling issues. The engine tended to overheat, the radio was unreliable, the landing gear had its own troubles. Most seriously, in high-altitude dives, precisely the flight regime where the P-47 would operate, shock waves formed around the aircraft as local airflow approached the speed of sound. These shock waves caused the flight controls to snatch and, in some cases, to lock completely. Pilots found themselves in uncontrolled dives, unable to pull out, the ground rushing up to meet them. This was a problem of compressibility, the physics of transonic flight, where air begins to behave more like a fluid than a gas. In 1942, this was barely understood. Chuck Yeager would not break the sound barrier until 1947, and much of what would become transonic aerodynamics was still theoretical. Kartveli's team had to solve these problems through trial and error, testing, modification, more testing. They added dive brakes. They modified control surfaces. They adjusted the wing's aerodynamic characteristics. Gradually, solutions emerged. The overheating was addressed with improved cooling flaps around the engine cowling. The radio problems were solved with better shielding and component reliability. The landing gear was strengthened and refined. The compressibility issues proved more stubborn, but pilots learned techniques to avoid or escape from high-speed dives, and later aircraft incorporated aerodynamic refinements that reduced the problem, though never entirely eliminated it. By April of 1943, the P-47 was finally ready for combat operations. The first operational mission with the 8th Air Force was flown on April 8, 1943. American pilots, many of whom had transitioned from smaller, lighter fighters, were about to encounter something remarkable. The P-47's performance in actual combat bore little resemblance to its performance on paper. The reception among combat pilots was initially skeptical, bordering on hostile. In January of 1943, General Frank Hunter, commander of the 8th Fighter Command, visited Royal Air Force Debden to announce that squadrons would be re-equipping with the P-47. When a Thunderbolt landed and taxied up beside the Spitfires the pilots currently flew, the reaction was immediate disbelief. The P-47 was enormous. Its wingtip stood higher than a Spitfire's cockpit. The Thunderbolt weighed 7 tons at combat weight, more than twice a Spitfire's weight. One pilot later wrote, "We were horrified at the thought of going to war in such a machine. We had enough trouble with the Focke-Wulf 190 in our nimble Spitfire Mark Vs. Now this lumbering 7-ton monster seemed infinitely worse, a true air inferiority fighter." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The pilots nicknamed it the Jug Short, either for juggernaut, reflecting its massive size and power, or because its bulky fuselage resembled a milk jug in silhouette. Neither interpretation was meant as a compliment. These men would soon be flying this aircraft against the Luftwaffe's best, and many were convinced they were looking at their own coffins. But combat would tell a different story. The P-47's first missions over Europe were high-altitude, escort duties and fighter sweeps. Almost immediately, pilots discovered capabilities that statistics and specifications had not revealed. The Thunderbolt could outdive anything in the sky, German, British, or American. When a P-47 pilot pushed the nose down and opened the throttle, no enemy fighter could follow. This provided a decisive escape method when combat turned against you, a way to break off engagement and live to fight another day. At low and medium altitudes, the Thunderbolt could not match the rate of climb or maneuverability of German fighters. A dogfight against a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf at 10,000 feet, where both aircraft could turn inside the heavier American fighter, was a losing proposition. But above 20,000 feet, and especially above 30,000 feet, where the turbocharger system delivered its full advantage, the P-47 was supreme. The thin air that starved other engines barely affected the double Wasp with its turbocharger, feeding it compressed air. At 40,000 feet, a P-47 could outrun, outclimb, and outfight anything the Luftwaffe could send against it. Pilots also discovered something else. The P-47 could absorb damage that would destroy other fighters. The radial engine, with its cylinders arranged in a circle around the crankshaft, could lose several cylinders to enemy fire and keep running. Liquid-cooled engines, by contrast, would seize within minutes if a single bullet punctured the cooling system. The structural strength built into the wings and fuselage to handle the recoil of 8 machine guns meant the airframe could withstand tremendous punishment. The armor protecting the pilot, the self-sealing fuel tanks, the sheer mass of the aircraft all contributed to survivability. Stories began circulating of P-47s returning to base with hundreds of bullet holes, with cylinders shot away, with control surfaces shredded, yet still flying. One Thunderbolt pilot counted over 200 holes in his aircraft after a mission. The ground crew shook their heads in amazement that he was alive. The aircraft had absorbed hits that would have killed a lighter fighter 3 times over, but the P-47's greatest contribution to the war effort would come not in air-to-air combat, but in a role Kartveli had never envisioned when he sketched that semi-elliptical wing on a train in 1940. The transformation began in late 1943. By that point, the P-47 had proven itself as an escort fighter, but its range was still insufficient to accompany bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany. The North American P-51 Mustang, with its laminar flow wing and efficient Merlin engine, would eventually take over long-range escort duties. But the Mustang, for all its speed and range, was lightly built. It could not carry the external loads that the P-47's massive wing and robust structure could handle. Commanders began experimenting with the Thunderbolt as a fighter-bomber. Early P-47Ds carried a single 500-pound bomb under the fuselage centerline. Then they added bombs under the wings. The bomb load increased from 500 pounds to 1,000 pounds, then to 1,500, then to 2,000. By mid-1944, a P-47 could carry 2,500 pounds of bombs, plus its 8 machine guns with full ammunition, and still perform as a fighter. To put this in perspective, medium bombers of World War II were generally defined as aircraft capable of delivering approximately 4,000 pounds of ordnance over ranges of 1,500 to 2,000 miles. The North American B-25 Mitchell, one of the war's most successful medium bombers, could carry 3,000 pounds of bombs internally in its bomb bay, plus additional bombs on external racks. The Martin B-26 Marauder had similar capacity. A single-seat fighter was now carrying bomb loads that approached those of twin-engine medium bombers. And unlike those bombers, which required crews of 4 to 6 men and were limited to level bombing from altitude, the P-47 could deliver its ordnance with precision. Fighter bombers could dive bomb specific targets, bridges, railroad junctions, tank columns with an accuracy no heavy or medium bomber could match. But bombs were only part of the story. In late 1943, the Army introduced the Mate rocket, a 4.5-inch unguided rocket with a 20-pound warhead. P-47s began carrying these rockets on underwing racks, initially in small numbers, then in larger clusters. By 1944, an improved rocket was available, the 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rocket, known universally as the HVAR, or colloquially as Holy Moses. Each HVAR carried a 45-pound warhead equivalent in destructive power to a 105mm howitzer shell. A P-47 could carry 10 of these rockets, 5 under each wing, plus bombs, plus its 8 machine guns. The firepower available to a single pilot in a single aircraft was staggering. Kartveli's wing design made all of this possible. The semi-elliptical wing he had sketched on that train provided not just aerodynamic efficiency, but internal volume for fuel and structural strength for external loads. The wing had been designed to carry 8 heavy machine guns, and their ammunition a purely offensive armament meant for air combat. But those same structural hardpoints, those same load-bearing members, could carry bombs, rockets, fuel tanks, or any combination thereof. The wing's internal structure was key. Unlike some aircraft designs where external stores were almost an afterthought, mounted on hasty modifications to existing structures, the P-47's wing was inherently robust. It had to be, to handle the forces of high-speed flight at its weight, to absorb machine gun recoil, to support the telescoping landing gear. That structural integrity meant the wing could be adapted to carry loads Kartveli had never specifically designed for. The P-47D-15 variant, entering service in 1944, incorporated further refinements specifically for the fighter-bomber role. Internal fuel capacity increased to 375 US gallons. The underwing bomb racks were made wet, meaning they were plumbed to carry fuel tanks instead of bombs, if mission requirements dictated. This gave the P-47 unprecedented flexibility: drop tanks for range, bombs for ground attack, rockets for armored targets, or any combination that mission planners deemed necessary. The effectiveness of this weapons system was demonstrated with brutal clarity during the Normandy campaign. Following D-Day on June 6, 1944, P-47s of the 9th Air Force flew close air support missions for Allied ground forces. Operating from forward airfields in France, Thunderbolt squadrons were assigned sectors and placed on call, ready to strike German positions whenever ground commanders radioed for assistance. The results were devastating. From D-Day until VE Day Victory in Europe Day on May 8, 1945, Thunderbolt pilots claimed to have destroyed 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. These numbers represent claims, not necessarily confirmed. Kills over claiming was endemic in all air forces, but even adjusting for probable exaggeration, the scale of destruction is remarkable. One engagement illustrates the Thunderbolt's ground attack capability. On July 29, 1944, during Operation Cobra, the American breakout from the Normandy beachhead, the 405th Fighter Group encountered a German column trapped near Roncy by elements of the U.S. 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions. The terrain had channeled the German vehicles into a narrow corridor between Roncy and Saint-Denis-le-Vêtu, creating a target-rich environment. The P-47s attacked this column from 3 to 10 p.m. until 9:40 p.m., over 6 hours of sustained strikes. Pilots made repeated passes, expending bombs, rockets, and machine gun ammunition, then returning to base to rearm and returning to the attack. When ground forces finally reached the area and counted the wreckage, they found 66 tanks, 204 vehicles, and 11 guns destroyed. A single fighter group, in one afternoon and evening, had eliminated the combat power of a German division. This was the kind of close air support that ground commanders had only dreamed about earlier in the war. Heavy bombers could obliterate cities but often missed tactical targets. Medium bombers were more precise but required clear weather and were vulnerable to fighters and flak. Fighter bombers like the P-47 combined the precision of a fighter with firepower that rivaled bombers, and they could operate in conditions that grounded heavier aircraft. The Royal Air Force, receiving 240 P-47Ds, designated Thunderbolt Mark I, and 590 P-47D-25s, designated Thunderbolt Mark II, adapted them specifically for ground attack. With no need for another high-altitude fighter, the Spitfire served that role adequately. The RAF deployed their Thunderbolts against Japanese forces in Burma beginning in 1944. Operating from bases in India, 16 RAF squadrons flew Thunderbolts in support of ground operations against the Japanese. They operated as cab ranks aircraft circling above the battlefield, waiting to be called in when ground forces encountered enemy positions. They attacked Japanese airfields and lines of communication. They flew escort missions. Armed with 3 500-pound bombs, or British RP-3, rockets 60-pound projectiles designed for attacking tanks and ships, they proved devastating during the Japanese breakout attempt at the Sitang Bend in the final months of the war. Long-range fuel tanks gave RAF Thunderbolts 5 hours of endurance sufficient to fly deep into Japanese-held territory, conduct attacks, and return safely. The combination of range, payload, and survivability made the P-47 ideal for the Burma theatre, where aircraft operated far from support facilities over some of the world's most unforgiving terrain. But even as the P-47 dominated in Europe and Asia, Kartveli and his team were developing the ultimate expression of the Thunderbolt concept. The P-47N, entering service in 1945, was designed specifically to escort Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers attacking the Japanese home islands from bases in the Mariana Islands, and later, Iwo Jima. The challenge was range. The distance from Iwo Jima to Tokyo was approximately 750 miles one way, 1,500 miles round trip, not counting combat maneuvering or allowance for navigation errors and headwinds. No existing single-engine fighter could escort bombers over such distances, fight enemy interceptors, and return safely. Kartveli's solution was to redesign the wing. The P-47N featured a completely new wing with squared-off tips rather than the elliptical tips of earlier versions. This new wing had a slightly greater span, 42 feet, 7 inches compared to 40 feet, 9 inches, and incorporated two 50-gallon fuel tanks built directly into the wing structure. These were not drop tanks, but integral fuel cells, sealed into the wing itself. Combined with increased fuselage fuel capacity and external drop tanks, the P-47N could carry a total of nearly 1,000 gallons of fuel. This gave it a range exceeding 1,000 miles, sufficient for the Iwo Jima to Tokyo mission with SIR-WA in reserves. The squared-off wingtips also improved roll rate, making the aircraft more responsive in combat. The P-47N entered production in late 1944 and early 1945. 1,816 were built before production ended. The very last Thunderbolt rolled off Republic's production line in October of 1945, just weeks after Japan's surrender. Thousands more had been on order, but with the war's end, contracts were cancelled. Total production of all P-47 variants reached 15,683 aircraft, more than any other American fighter of World War II. This total exceeded the North American P-51 Mustang's production run and dwarfed most other Allied fighter types. The scale of production reflected not just military demand, but confidence in the basic soundness of Kartveli's design. At war's end, the cost to produce a single P-47 had dropped to $83,000, roughly $1.4 million in current dollars, adjusted for inflation. This represented remarkable economies of scale, given that the first prototypes had cost many times that amount. Republic Aviation had perfected mass production techniques, training thousands of workers to build these complex machines with precision and speed. But the true measure of the P-47's success was not production numbers or cost figures. It was in the numbers of pilots who came home alive. The Thunderbolt's loss rate per mission was among the lowest of any Allied fighter operating over Europe or the Pacific. Exact figures vary depending on theatre and time period, but most analyses place the P-47's loss rate at approximately 1 aircraft per 200 sorties in the European theatre, a rate significantly lower than lighter, more manoeuvrable fighters operating in the same conditions. This survivability was not accidental. Every decision Kartveli had made, the radial, engine, the structural strength built into the wings and fuselage, the armour protection, the self-sealing fuel tanks, even the sheer size and weight of the aircraft contributed to keeping pilots alive. In air combat, the Thunderbolt could absorb damage that would down other fighters. In ground attack, flying through intense anti-aircraft fire at low altitude, the P-47's ruggedness meant the difference between returning to base damaged and not returning at all. Pilots developed genuine affection for the aircraft. The nickname Jug, initially derisive, became a term of endearment. They told stories of flying home on 5 cylinders after 3 had been shot away, of landing with control surfaces hanging by cables after the hydraulics were destroyed, of climbing out of cockpits to find their aircraft riddled with holes they hadn't even noticed in the heat of combat. One pilot described the P-47 as a pilot's aircraft responsive enough to dogfight when necessary, stable enough for precision bombing, powerful enough to escape trouble, and tough enough to bring you home when everything went wrong. For men flying daily missions over hostile territory, knowing the enemy would do everything possible to kill them, that toughness mattered more than statistics about speed or climb rate. The irony of the P-47's success is that it excelled in a role Kartveli never intended. He had designed a high-altitude interceptor, a fighter meant to operate in the thin, cold air at 40,000 feet, where turbocharging and structural strength mattered more than maneuverability. What he created was the most effective fighter bomber of World War II, an aircraft that spent more time at low altitude, attacking ground targets with bombs and rockets, than it ever did in the high-altitude pure fighter role for which it was conceived. This transformation reveals something fundamental about weapon system design. The best designs are not necessarily those optimized for a single role, but those robust and adaptable enough to excel in roles never anticipated. Kartveli's semi-elliptical wing, sketched on a train to solve one problem, ended up solving problems he didn't know existed. The structural strength built into that wing to handle 8 machine guns also handled bombs and rockets. The internal volume created by the wing's thickness, necessary for fuel and landing gear, provided space for additional systems. The hardpoints, designed for guns, could mount ordnance pylons. Every design choice cascaded into capabilities that emerged only when the aircraft met the chaotic demands of actual warfare. After the war ended in 1945, the U.S. Army Air Forces, which became the independent U.S. Air Force in 1947, began rapidly demobilizing. Thousands of aircraft were declared surplus. P-47s, so recently essential to victory, were scrapped by the hundreds or sold to Allied nations for nominal sums. The Strategic Air Command operated P-47s from 1946 through 1947, and the Air National Guard flew them until 1953, when the aircraft received the designation 47 under a new naming convention. But by the mid-1950s, the Thunderbolt had effectively disappeared from American service, replaced by jets. Yet Kartveli's design philosophy persisted. He had moved on to jets himself even before the war ended, developing the F-84 Thunderjet in 1944. This aircraft, entering production in 1946, applied lessons learned from the P-47 to the jet age. Republic would build more than 10,000 F-84s in various versions, and Kartveli would go on to design the F-105 Thunderchief, another heavy, single-engine fighter bomber that would serve with distinction in Vietnam. In the 1960s, Kartveli worked on advanced concepts for the Air Force, including ramjet, propulsion systems, and even early space shuttle designs. NASA's History Office would later acknowledge his contributions to ramjet technology and orbital vehicle concepts, ideas that presaged the space shuttle by more than a decade. But perhaps his most enduring design came late in his career. In the early 1970s, Kartveli served as a consultant to Fairchild Republic, the successor to Republic Aviation, on a new close air support aircraft. The specifications called for an aircraft that could survive intense ground fire while destroying enemy armor. It needed heavy armament, long loiter time, and the ability to operate from rough forward airfields. Kartveli's design incorporated a massive 30mm cannon, 11 hardpoints for bombs and rockets, twin engines mounted high on the fuselage for survivability, and a titanium bathtub protecting the pilot. The aircraft was deliberately slow, cruising speed around 300 miles per hour, because close air support required loiter time and precision, not speed. The Fairchild Republic P-47 Thunderbolt II, nicknamed the Warthog, entered service in 1977. Alexander Kartveli died on June 20, 1974, 3 years before the P-47 became operational. He never saw his final design in combat. But the P-47 would prove even more durable than the P-47, serving continuously from 1977 to the present day, nearly 50 years of service and counting. As of this recording, the P-47 remains the U.S. Air Force's primary close air support aircraft, beloved by ground troops for the same reasons. Soldiers in World War II appreciated the P-47. It shows up, it destroys the enemy, and it brings the pilot home. The through line connecting the P-47, the F-84, the F-105, and the P-47 is not any single technological innovation. It is a design philosophy. Build them strong, arm them heavily, and prioritize, bringing the pilot home. This philosophy came from a man who understood survival, who had fled revolution, built a new life in exile, and spent decades designing aircraft to defeat the totalitarianism he had escaped. For Alexander Kartveli, aircraft design was never merely an engineering problem, it was personal. Every fighter he designed would be flown by someone's son, someone's brother, someone's father. The structural strength he built into his aircraft, the armor protecting the cockpit, the redundant systems that kept damaged aircraft flying, these were not abstractions but moral imperatives. In interviews late in his life, Kartveli spoke about aviation's future with the same enthusiasm he had brought to his work in the 1920s. It is possible with reasonable advancement of our knowledge to go beyond the Moon to Venus and Mars, he told a reporter, provided we retain enthusiasm, enterprise, and daring. These were the qualities that had carried him from Tbilisi to Paris to New York, from refugee to chief engineer, from a sketch on a train to 15,000 aircraft that helped win a world war. The contrast between Kartveli's personal story and his professional accomplishments illuminates something essential about the Second World War and the 20th century more broadly. The war was fought not just by armies and navies, but by ideas and innovations. The side that mobilized talent most effectively, that gave refuge to exiled engineers and scientists, that channeled their creativity into practical weapons, that side possessed an advantage as decisive as any battle. America's military-industrial complex in World War II was built substantially by immigrants and children of immigrants. Men like Kartveli, fleeing tyranny in Europe, found in America not just refuge but opportunity to contribute. The P-47 Thunderbolt, arguably the quintessential American fighter of the war, was designed by a Georgian who had arrived penniless 13 years before its first flight. The atomic bomb would be developed under the direction of Robert Oppenheimer, whose parents had fled Germany, based on physics insights from Albert Einstein, a refugee from Nazi Germany. This was not coincidental. Totalitarian regimes drove away talent they deemed unreliable Jews, political dissidents, ethnic minorities, anyone who might question authority. Democratic societies welcomed that talent and gave it the freedom to innovate. The result was a technological and industrial advantage that ultimately proved decisive. Kartveli's personal story embodies this larger pattern. He had no particular reason to feel loyalty to America in 1940. He was not yet even an American citizen when he designed the P-47. He would not be naturalized until later in the war. Georgia, his homeland, was under Soviet occupation. He could have chosen to work for any nation that offered him employment. But he chose America, and America chose him. The United States government, despite its surveillance concerns, allowed him to design some of the nation's most critical weapons. Republic Aviation, despite his recent immigration and his status as a foreign national, made him chief engineer and vice president. This mutual trust produced results that neither side could have achieved alone. The surveillance that followed Kartveli throughout his career was real and burdensome. His work remained classified for decades. His name rarely appeared in public. Even today, he remains largely unknown outside aviation circles, despite having designed aircraft that helped win World War II and that remain in service into the 21st century. But the surveillance never prevented him from working, never forced him into exile again, never silenced his voice entirely. Contrast this with what happened to engineers and scientists in totalitarian states. In Germany, the Nazis drove out Jewish scientists, depriving themselves of the nuclear physics that might have given them atomic weapons. In the Soviet Union, purges removed competent engineers, replacing them with politically reliable mediocrities. Both regimes suffered from the predictable consequences: technological stagnation, strategic blunders, ultimately defeat, or, in the Soviet case, eventual collapse. Democratic societies are messy and inefficient. Security services worry about espionage, often excessively. Bureaucracies resist innovation. But democracies possess one overwhelming advantage: they can harness talent regardless of its origin. An immigrant from Georgia can design America's most important fighter. A patent clerk from Switzerland can revolutionize physics. Refugees from tyranny can build the weapons that defeat it. This is the deeper lesson of the P-47 Thunderbolt and Alexander Kartveli's career. The wing he sketched on a train was not just an engineering solution to aerodynamic and structural problems. It was a vindication of the departed and principles he had risked everything to reach: the freedom to innovate, to question assumptions, to try radical solutions. These were inseparable from the political freedoms that totalitarianism denied. When P-47 pilots flew into combat, they carried with them the accumulated expertise of exiled engineers, refugee scientists, immigrant workers. The aircraft itself was a rebuke to every assumption underlying totalitarian ideology. It proved that free men, working voluntarily toward shared goals, could create something a million slaves could never match. Kartveli did not speak publicly about these philosophical dimensions of his work. He was, by all accounts, a modest man who avoided publicity and focused on engineering problems rather than grand theories. But the trajectory of his life spoke volumes. He fled Bolshevism in 1919. He spent the next 55 years designing weapons to defeat the ideologies Nazism, fascism, communism that had driven him from his homeland. The P-47 Thunderbolt destroyed German tanks in France, Japanese positions in Burma, and later, in other hands, served in the Korean War and in dozens of smaller conflicts. But its most important victory was not any single battle. It was the proof that liberal democratic societies, for all their flaws, possessed capabilities that totalitarian states could not match. By war's end, the material disparity between the Allies and the Axis was staggering. America alone produced more aircraft, tanks, ships, and weapons than all Axis nations combined. This was not merely a matter of resources. Germany had access to the resources of occupied Europe. Japan controlled much of East Asia. The disparity reflected different approaches to organizing human effort. Free societies, it turned out, were more efficient than slave societies, more innovative than regimented societies, more resilient than societies built on fear. The P-47's production history illustrates this. 15,683 aircraft, built by workers who were paid fair wages, who could change jobs if they wished, who could unionize, who could complain about working conditions. Compare this to German factories using slave labor from concentration camps workers, who were starved, beaten, worked to death, and who sabotaged production whenever possible. Which system produced more? Which produced better quality? The answer was never in doubt. By 1944, Allied air superiority was so complete that German aircraft rarely left the ground. The Luftwaffe had fine aircraft, the Me-109, the TW-190, later the Me-262 jet fighter, but they could not build enough of them, could not train enough pilots, could not overcome the sheer weight of Allied numbers backed by Allied industrial capacity. The P-47 was emblematic of this material supremacy. When Thunderbolts arrived over Europe in 1943, their pilots faced a numerically superior Luftwaffe flying from interior lines, supported by radar and ground control. 2 years later, in 1945, P-47s flew wherever they wished, at will, in formations so large they blackened the sky, facing sporadic and ineffective opposition. This transformation was not inevitable. It required mobilizing not just industrial capacity, but human creativity. It required leaders willing to take risks on unconventional designs. It required engineers willing to work 80-hour weeks for years on end. It required pilots willing to fly experimental aircraft that might kill them. It required workers willing to labor in factories far from home. It required a society organized to harness all these elements toward a common goal. And fundamentally, it required being the kind of society that people like Alexander Kartveli chose to join rather than flee. This was America's secret weapon, not the P-47 itself, but the system that could conceive, design, produce, and employ 15,683 P-47s. A system that welcomed an immigrant engineer and gave him the freedom to create something remarkable. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.